Another one is the power of an endless life. Again, this is hinted at in the Abrahamic, is elevated more in the Davidic, and certainly is highlighted in the New and Everlasting Covenant. And where we get the power of an endless life from is that when Abraham came back from the slaughter of the kings, Melchizedek met him. And Melchizedek was a priest forever. He was an eternal priest and a king. Now, there are some who say that Melchizedek was a natural person. I believe he was a natural person, but it's a pre-cross manifestation of Christ. Melchizedek was actually Jesus coming down to bless Abraham. So the power of an endless life comes through the Melchizedek priesthood, not the Levitical priesthood. The Levitical priesthood ceased at the cross. So now it is replaced by a better covenant, a better priesthood. So the Levitical priesthood died out. Now we've got the eternal Melchizedek priesthood. Another promise was that there would be kings that would come out of Abraham. So there were Israelite kings. That was part of the sand seed promise. But also, as part of the star seed promise, there would be a kingdom of priests. And we know from the New Covenant scriptures, that's the church, that's you, that's me. We are a kingdom of priests. And with that, also from Abraham comes the birth of the Messiah. And that's fulfilled in the New Covenant. So that's the blessing of kings. Okay, there's also the blessing of communion with bread and wine. Genesis 14, 19 to 20. Genesis 14, 19 to 20. Blessing of bread and wine. There's the blessing of friendship and relationship. In Isaiah 41:8, it talks about, it says, "But you, Israel, are my servant, Jacob, whom I've chosen, the descendants of Abraham, my friend." And in 2 Chronicles 20, verse 7, 2 Chronicles 20, verse 7, it also talks about how Abraham was God's friend. So there's that promise of not just, remember, this is radical stuff, because back then, gods were either, there was the moon god. In fact, Abraham came from a culture that worshipped the moon. That was the pagan religion of his culture. So for God to say, Abraham's my friend, this is radical. But of course, that flows through into the new covenant, and there's that sense that he is our friend as well. There's a blessing of hope. Abraham kept looking for a city whose builder and maker was God. And I was thinking about this just before we came on. This blessing of hope, I think today this is more important than ever. There are so many mental health problems, and mental health is a loss of hope. But in the Abrahamic, flowing through the cross to the new and everlasting covenant, we have a blessed hope. We have a great hope. We have all these promises that God has given us. We have the promise of eternal life. We have the promise of friendship. We have the promise of grace. We have the promise of all the aspects of the kingdom are now within us. What an amazing hope. So I think that blessing of hope, that promise of hope is more important than ever. There was also the promise of giving tithes with a thankful heart. So Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek in response to him being blessed. So there was a reciprocal blessing. There was Melchizedek blessed Abram, we should say, that was his name back then. And then out of a heart response, came a giving back to Melchizedek. And the last promise I'll put there, because we've got to move on, is the promise of land. Now, the promise of land to Abraham is part of the sand seed promise. And this was already fulfilled in Joshua chapter 21, verse 43. Joshua 21, verse 43. So we've had the intention of the covenant, We've had some of the promises of the covenant. By the way, there were minor promises to Abraham himself, his wife, and his family. They are minor ones. We won't go into those now. I've given you the major ones that are relevant to us today. So we've had the intention, we've had the promises. Now, what are the sacrifices of that covenant?